Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. For months, almost a year actually, the refrain has sounded, Russia hacked the election. Russia colluded with Donald Trump. It was unprecedented behavior, treasonous, really. Heard that night after night on this show. We've been told we need a massive, semi-permanent investigation to expose all these crimes. We might even need to nullify a presidential election. Okay, so let's say that Russia did hack the election. What would that look like? A few $1,000s spent on lame, ineffective Facebook ads? Probably not. Instead, it might look a lot like what was actually going on for years at the Podesta Group, the Democratic lobbying firm co-founded by Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta. According to a source we spoke to who worked there at the Podesta Group for years, the company received huge sums of money from a pro-Russia shell group in order to bolster Russia's interests in Washington, all without declaring itself the agent of a foreign power, which it demonstrably was. Election hacking might also look like the infamous and fraudulent Trump dossier, which was compiled in 2016 and then released this past January by BuzzFeed as a laughably stupid news story. Much of the information in that dossier came from Russian sources with ties to the Kremlin. Who paid for this? Well, at one point, funding came from the Democratic National Committee, Hillary Clinton's campaign, possibly even the FBI. So let's say you were looking for a smoking gun in this Russia story, and many are looking for that smoking gun. We now have evidence that Democrats literally paid money for Russian intelligence, as well as proof that the top Democratic lobbying firm in Washington was getting rich by advancing Russian interests. Collusion? If that's not collusion, what is collusion? We put a lot of calls out today, and very few Democratic lawmakers were interested in talking about this at all. The rare exception was Brad Sherman of California, the honorable exception, and he joins us tonight. Congressman, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you. I'm here to talk about the tax bill.
The tax bill. Well, unfortunately,
I mean, this is a job-killing, deficit-exploding tax bill, which is the real story, the real vote in Congress.
Let me just cut you off.
I know you can't defend it.
Before you go, we don't have a tax bill. We have no idea what the details are.
We have
I'm deeply interested in this.
Trump-proposed 12-page document.
We have literally nothing.
We have a 12-page document, which is pretty long.
And then it'll get to the Senate, and it will become something completely different. So I would love to debate that because I think it's really interesting, and we may not even disagree on parts of it. But I want to ask you about the story that we have spent the last year talking about.
You can't defend the Trump tax proposal.
This is clever, and I will have you on any day to talk about an actual tax bill.
No, you won't. I've been trying to get on your show to talk about economics again and again and again, and you only have me on to talk about nonsense.
Spare me.
Nonsense. And then,
really, the nonsense that the Democratic Party has hijacked the workings of Washington for the last year over this Trump story, or the Russia story, and for you to say
you've got no defense for Trump's impeachment. The man has committed high crimes and misdemeanors, and your only defense is, well, Hillary did too. You can't impeach a private citizen and say that's a reason not to impeach a president who's guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. I am.
I think you've jumped off the rails a little bit. Let me ask you some factual questions and see how you do with those. You can put the bumper stickers away. What do you make of the fact that the Podesta Group, with whom I know you're personally familiar, was taking money from Russian interests to advance those interests in Washington?
I'd like to take a look at it, but it's irrelevant to whether we should impeach Donald Trump. He is guilty of obstruction of justice.
But
you're trying
so you're not even going to engage on that question? What do you make of the fact that the Democratic National Committee, from whom I assume you take money, gave money to the people who wrote the Trump dossier, whose information came from Kremlin-connected sources? Does that bother you? That they used Russian intelligence in the course of this?
That dossier was funded first and foremost by Trump's Republican opponents.
Correct.
There is nothing in that dossier.
Whose names we don't know.
Correct. There is nothing in that dossier that appears to be stolen information. What we have here...
Well, first of all, you don't know that. And
well, I don't know whether there are Martians are landing on the planet.
Of that, but we know for a fact, because it's been conceded, that information, some of it, came from sources around Vladimir Putin.
This is a document that had no effect until months
your
after
excuse?
the election.
So I'm just a simple question.
No.
Look,
I don't need an excuse because whether we impeach the character of a private citizen is an irrelevancy. Whether we impeach a president who is guilty of obstruction of justice.
Wait, but I'm talking, hold on, slow down.
Okay, this had no effect on the election.
The presidential election, well, you don't know if it had an effect on the election or not.
How can you affect an election by a document that's released 3 months after the election?
Because the information, the document was run in BuzzFeed. The information went to the Hillary Clinton campaign.
And information that was of absolutely no use. Scurrilous rumors about the sex life of Donald Trump that were not released.
I'm a little bit surprised that you have spent the last year telling us that Trump has colluded in some way with the Russian government and that he has committed, in effect, treason, which is basically what you've been arguing.
I don't accuse him of treason. I accuse him of obstruction of justice. Take a look at Section 1512 of the Felony Code.
But you're not bothered by the fact.
He's committed obstruction of justice 3 times. It's not the crime. It's the cover-up.
Right.
We learned that with Watergate, and we learned that now. And Richard Nixon could not have stayed in office.
Richard Nixon?
Richard Nixon could not have stayed.
I'm asking you a really simple question about the news of today, which is...
No, the news of today is this tax bill that's going to cost us millions of jobs.
You don't know what's
That's what happened.
The tax bill.
We do have the Trump tax proposal that you can't defend, but is the official and most significant economic document released by the Trump administration in 10 months.
I think I'm searching back in my mental files to recall an example of greater disingenuousness than the one I'm witnessing now. You went bananas over the Donald Trump Jr. meeting. Oh, he met with a Russian. This is, the end of times.
I never said that.
Yes,
you've got me confused with another good-looking bald guy.
No, I don't. You are the guy who did that. I'll get the tape.
It's the obstruction of justice, and I've identified
telling us why it was so poisonous to American democracy for Trump or his campaign to have any contact with the Russians.
No, my
now we have evidence that the Democratic campaign was doing it.
You've got me confused with some other good-looking bald guy.
I follow this for a living. But let me ask you
I follow this for a living, too. And I know that this is the most significant economic document released by the Trump administration. You can't defend it, and you want to talk about nonsense.
I'm sorry, let me ask you.
You want to talk about why Hillary Clinton is bad instead of why Donald Trump should be impeached.
You filed articles of impeachment
for obstruction of justice
the day after that story about Trump's son broke. That's the day that you. Oh, that was just an accident. Okay, right. This is look.
I circulated those articles of impeachment a month before the date you identified.
Okay, so let me ask you a really. It was July 12th. Let me ask you a simple question. Trump's connections to Russia, you have consistently argued, are a big deal. It's not a fake story.
No, I have consistently argued that as obstruction of justice last February, May, and July are violations of Section 1512 of our Felony Code. Obstruction of justice applies whether there was collusion or not.
It has nothing to do. So your entire party has spent the last year telling us this is the most important thing that has ever happened. We now have evidence that the charges you are making against Trump apply to your own party and your own candidate, and you're ignoring it, and you're throwing this fit on my set telling me, oh, it's not a big deal. Why do you want to talk about the tax bill?
May and July. Obstruction of justice 3 times, violation of Section 1512.
You're not even, you know what? I honestly, it's hard for me to believe, given everything you've said in the last year, that you're putting on this performance now. Why don't you just say, look, what Hillary did, her campaign paying for intelligence from the Russians, that was bad, but she's not president, let's move on. You won't even say that.
I don't know what Hillary did, except she
Actually, we do know. What do you mean we don't know? We know exactly what she did. They admitted it this week.
They admitted that they paid for opposition research. Every campaign
well, of course they all do.
For opposition research.
That comes from the Russians? This dossier came from the Russians.
No, this dossier came from a research firm and a British individual.
Really? And who is the British individual? Do you know?
I believe his name is Mr. Steele.
Yeah. And why was he hired? Because he was the head of the Russia desk at MI6. He was a Russia expert, and the information was about Trump's ties to Russia. They got this information from the Russians, and they paid, in effect, Russian sources for it.
They paid a man to prepare a memo.
Quick, does it bother you? Does that bother you at all?
Not particularly.
Does it bother you? Has the Podesta Group ever lobbied you for anything?
I believe they have. I believe they've also. I believe you're also a friend of Tony.
I'm not a friend of him, and he's never lobbied me. I'm not a sitting.
Well, you're not a member of Congress, yes.
And I'm not a friend of Tony Podesta's. But does it bother you that Tony Podesta took money with Paul Manafort from the Russians to carry their water in Washington?
Does it bother you that Paul Manafort was chair of Trump's campaign?
Yes, it does.
Well,
does it bother you that the Podesta firm was working on behalf of the Russians?
I would like to. If it was true, it would bother me.
It is true. I mean,
You're asserting it. A lot of things are asserted on this.
No, I'm not asserting it.
Okay.
It is factually
You're
true
saying that he failed to file a foreign agent's report.
You know, that's I believe that to be true. What I know is true is that they took money from Russian interests to represent those interests here in Washington.
Well,
and I think by your standards, that's wrong.
When you say Russian interests, if you mean private companies, that's different.
No, I mean I mean the Russian government. I mean the Russian government.
If he did it. Why don't you want to talk about impeaching a president? And your answer is, hey, there's this lobbyist in town who's any good.
Because the predicate for this impeachment is exactly the same behavior.
You haven't read my articles of
have.
impeachment are only a page and a half, and you haven't bothered to read them.
Actually, I have read them.
Then you know
and
they're about
And I think they're even more
justice.
fatuous now than I did before, now that I know that there's no principle that undergirds them, that you're willing to excuse anything the Democrats do.
Justice is a crime. Yeah. It is a felony punishable by 20 years, up to 20 years.
Come back when you got a tax bill and you want to chat about it.
The tax bill's been released, and you can't defend it.
Yeah, right. Byron York, chief political correspondent at the Washington Examiner. He joins us tonight. Byron, we're going to use inside voices now. So you just heard Congressman Sherman, who's sitting still right next to me, say, in effect, it's not a big deal that the Hillary campaign paid for this dossier or that the Podesta group was lobbying on behalf of the Russians.
Yeah. Are you going to talk about me?
We're going to talk about right here. Wasn't a big deal.
Yes, it was a big deal. But even before we had this revelation from the Washington Post that the DNC and the Hillary campaign had paid for the dossier, even before we knew that, I think you saw a shift in tone among Democrats away from collusion.
And started yelling about the tax bill?
No, they were talking more. They were talking about Russia's active measures in the campaign, and Russia did have a campaign to influence our presidential election. There's no doubt about that. And indeed, you see what the articles of impeachment are about obstruction of justice, about the president's firing of James Comey. In other words, you get to a point where collusion doesn't matter. So you don't have to prove that. It's just that the president obstructed justice.
We've repainted the slogans on the barn. We never said that. Yeah. We're just moving on to that.
But I think what has happened now is after an attempt to paint Russian involvement as a one-way street where the Russians were trying to hurt Hillary and help Trump, and Trump was somehow dealing with them, I think we've seen it's a much more complicated picture, because it is a fact that this foreign agent, the former British spy, Christopher Steele, did get information from Russians who were connected to the Kremlin. You just look at the dossier. The dossier has source A and source B and source C, and they're identified as, you know, a senior Russian foreign ministry official, or a former senior Russian intelligence official, or a senior Russian financial official. So it's not a secret that they're dealing with people who are in the Russian government connected to the Kremlin. So what has changed now is we're now seeing these Democratic efforts to get dirt on Trump from Russia. And that does sound suspiciously like what Donald Trump Jr. thought he was going to get in that June 2016 meeting at Trump Tower, when some Russians had approached him and claimed to have had some sort of dirt on Hillary Clinton. They didn't, and that's not what the meeting was about. But it's very similar here.
Interesting. We still have the Congress. Would you like to interject?
My articles of impeachment have always been about obstruction of justice. It's not the crime, it's the cover-up. We've got 3 different instances of violation of Section 1512. They do not, whether Trump colluded or he didn't collude. He tried to stop the investigation of Flynn.
Are you a little embarrassed? Tell me you're a little bit embarrassed by these revelations.
I'm not embarrassed at all. What I'm embarrassed is that we're not here talking about impeaching a president and stopping a bad
thing. You think are important.
Yes. The things that are important to the American people is who's their president and what's their tax bill, not whether the last candidate for president had a good campaign or didn't have a campaign.
We've had you on many times.
It's as silly as trying to say that Richard Nixon should be in office because you have dirt on George McGovern.
So let me.
That's insane.
Thank you very much. You rose to the occasion. Let me just ask you quickly, given the performance you just saw from Congressman Sherman, if Democrats were to take control of the House of Representatives in the midterm election a little more than a year from now, how long would it take, do you think, to impeach the president?
You know, I think that's a bit of a fuzzy question, because go back to 2006. George W. Bush's poll numbers are in the tank, and it looks like Democrats are going to win the House, which they do. But early on in the election, before the election, John Conyers, who stood to become the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, was talking about impeaching President Bush. There was a lot of talk from the left wing of the Democratic Party about impeaching Bush, so much so that prior to the election, Nancy Pelosi, who stood to become Speaker, came out and said impeachment is off the table because they didn't want the election to be about impeachment. And if you have a lot of talk about these articles of impeachment coming up to next year,
that's a good point.
Look what could happen.
We'll talk about the commercial break. We're out of time. Would you like to read the tease, Congressman?
I'll read the tease. The post-Weinstein backlash against sexual harassment is consuming a top political analyst at MSNBC. But what are the risks of accountability turning into witch hunt? More right-wing take on this will come up right after the commercial.
Thank you.